Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first panel.
Good morning.
My name is Yalin, and I am the Columbia UNICEF Board Secretary and a member of the Outreach Committee. I am so excited to have everyone here. Our topic for this panel is keeping refugee and migrant children learning and healthy and eliminating discrimination. I will start by introducing our panelists, then we will dive into the discussion based on our panel topic. I'll be directing questions to specific panelists, and they will have 2 to 3 minutes to respond. We will conclude with a 10 minutes Q&A session between the audience and the panelists. We have Dr. Isam Daud. He is a child psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and a TED Fellow and speaker. He is also the co-founder and mental health director for Humanity Crew, an international aid organization specializing in the provision of first response mental health interventions to refugees and people in crises. We also have Ms. Greta Gunnarsdottir. She is the director of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees Office in New York. She has over 30 years of experience in diplomacy and multilateral affairs. Before her current position, Ms. Gunnarsdottir served as ambassador, permanent representative, and director for various international foreign affairs committees. Mr. Nyenhuis. He is the executive director and president of Thrive Gulu, a trauma recovery organization operating in northern Uganda. Mick has worked as a program specialist in refugee resettlement in Lowell, Massachusetts. And he has also served as the director of a nationwide urban refugee program in Cambodia. And last but not least, we have Professor Mike Wessels. He is a professor of clinical population and family health in the program on forced migration and health at Columbia University. A longtime psychosocial and child protection practitioner who regularly advises UN agencies and governments. He is currently the lead researcher on the interagency multi-country research on community-led child protection. Thank you all for being here. It is truly an honor for us to have you. To start with a question, this first question is for Ms. Gunnarsdottir. Currently, you are the director for the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees Office in New York, and you have worked for various foreign affairs committees. From your experiences, could you tell us about to what extent the education of refugee children is adversely impacted? And what measures can we take to provide them with more resources in order for them to catch up with their peers?
Yes, thank you so much, Ms. Lynn, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting UNRWA and myself to this meeting, and good morning to fellow panelists and participants, and yeah, how education is adversely impacted. I think if you are thinking about only for refugees, or if you are thinking about the pandemic, it is a little bit, I think the answer to the question is a bit different when it comes to UNRWA, in a sense, because we have, I think I need to explain a little bit, even though it takes maybe 1 or 2 minutes, because our agency has been in existence for now 70 years. And so we have all these structures and systems and stuff in place when it comes to education, which is our biggest program. And we have over 500,000 kids in school. And we have about 8,000 students in vocational and training centers. And most of these schools belong to UNRWA. I mean, they have been built by the agency, but in some fields, and especially in Lebanon, we have to rent housing, which is often just apartment buildings with small classrooms. And we have, about 700 schools, and so this is we are what we call a direct service provider. So we have teachers that actually teach children in school that are registered as Palestine refugees with the agency. But under normal circumstances, if we put normal within quote unquote, because we are operating in what we call 5 fields of operations, and that's Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. And in all these fields, we have a number of challenges, and they have been increasing in the past few years. With extreme poverty and food insecurity, and of course the occupation and the conflict in Syria and all the consequences thereof. And now with a very dire economic situation in both Lebanon and Syria, that was not maybe the case a few years back. So the situation is very challenging to begin with for the kids. I mean, the environment that they come from and the environment that we are operating in. And then on top of that, now we have the COVID pandemic, and of course everybody it's a challenge to every educational system. In our case, I think we were fairly successful in the spring when the pandemic came up. We introduced or put in place, so to speak, what we call emergency education. And that is not the first time we have done so, but it's because of conflict situations. But this time, all the schools were closed. All the schools were closed in all the fields. So we had this emergency or remote education introduced for all students. And there, of course, you have challenges that are very maybe unique in many ways to the refugees, and just also overall to people sometimes that live in our fields of operations. And that is electricity to begin with. There are challenges with electricity in Gaza and Lebanon. There are challenges when it comes to connectivity, because of course we were trying to have both printed material and online. And with connectivity, it's both cost and also if it is just there to begin with, a Wi-Fi. And then with equipment, because very often you have maybe just one phone per family, and the families will have a lot of children most of the time. And with other kinds of tablets, that is not sort of a common ownership. I mean, so these are, I think there are challenges that are there to begin with, and then that also are made more difficult with the pandemic. And of course, this then creates well, sort of issues with access to education. But as I said, we do provide written material. That is what we do, and we also have the parents come in and hand back the homework. So maybe a little bit of a long answer, but I thought it required a little bit of an explanation also beforehand. Thank you.
Thank you for an informative response. This next question is for Professor Wessels. Professor Wessels, I know you have experience in conducting extensive research on the holistic impacts of war and political violence on children. Could you talk about some ways we can approach the introduction of modern healthcare ethically and responsibly to refugee children in need?
Thanks very much, Ella, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. I think We have to approach it with, first of all, with cultural humility. We have to recognize that every culture has its own systems. For example, with regard to mental health, cultures construct their own idioms of what it means to be well or what it means to be ill. They may have traditional healers, they may have traditional practices, which are really important. So for us as outsiders, we may tend to bring in very universalized approaches, most of which are constructed in the West or in the global North. And these, of course, are evidence-based. They have discernible strengths. I find much value in them. But when we impose them on local people, we can actually end up weakening the indigenous supports that are already there. And this raises big issues of do no harm. And I'd like for us as humanitarians to really put our ethical obligations front and center. So if I could give you one example, during the decades-long war in Angola, a lot of people were thinking, because of the high exposure of children to torture, killing, death, displacement, loss of parents, and so on, that post-traumatic stress disorder was the big problem. And to be sure, it was a problem. But I was working with former child soldiers at that point, and we encountered a 14-year-old boy who said, I can't sleep at night, and people keep their distance from me. He was badly stigmatized. And we asked why he couldn't sleep at night, and he said, well, the spirit of the man I killed comes to me and asks, why did you do this to me? And it turned out, on additional learning, that he said that the local belief was that being haunted by a spirit, whom you had killed, was viewed as you were carrying unavenged spirits with you who could harm not only you, but also your family and your community. So the stigma was actually based on spiritual contamination. His major concern was about spiritual contamination. This is not the thing that Western psychiatry and psychology typically thinks of. And again, I don't want to romanticize it and say that it's more important than PTSD, but we have to, as outsiders, work with people where they are, respect local culture, and I think create a dialogue within which it's a locally led process of adopting newer processes. So what we did in this context, this was through an NGO now called Child Fund, we actually pictured ourselves as working at a common table. We brought to the table some lessons from other war zones and some universal ideas. Local people brought to the table ideas about spirituality and about harmony with the ancestors, which were terribly important. They brought an in-depth understanding of the context and all their resources of resilience. And then we discussed how these different approaches might be interwoven, and the decision-making was actually led by local people. That, I would say, is a better approach than a sort of neo-colonial approach where it's outsiders who hold all the power and basically dictate to people what happens to them. So I would say that cultural humility is something that we really need to start with. And just as a footnote, it's not part of most training programs or selection programs at graduate level. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wessels, for that very informative response. And Dr. Isam Daud, you have worked with refugee children, and in your TED Talk, How We Can Bring Mental Health Support to Refugees, you advocate for the importance of psychological support for refugee children. Could you enlighten us on what community programs and strategies will be effective in making children immigrants feel less alone?
Hello, everyone. I'm really grateful and honored to be part of this panel. Thank you for the invitation. I don't know which program is the right one. I think we need to start a little bit before with that we need to create the communities. The problem is when there is a displacement, the first thing that people lose is their community. When you are struggling with, with stress and fear, and when there's a threat to your life, you actually activate your fight or flight system. It's a biological reaction that makes you be ready to fight and to run for your life. And when we do so, we actually lose our community, because communities are built upon the social norms and our ability to understand the importance of relationships and reasoning and abstraction and planning and many other executive functions and high functions that we actually deactivate in times of crisis when our fight or flight system is activated. So the first thing actually refugees or displaced population lose is their community. For example, when I work with Syrian refugees who are coming with the boats and to Greece, for example, I never saw, and I'm totally behind my statement, man. I never saw a whole family come together, and it's usually a father, a mother, and the children. There is no cousins and brothers and sisters, and the whole tribe is coming together. When we are actually talking about people who are coming from an Eastern culture, that so most probably they live all together as me. I'm one of them. Like all my cousins, my 54 cousins are, all of us is living next to each other. So why? What happened for the Syrians, for example, who live just a few miles from my hometown, to flee their home when there was war? Only the biological family only together. This is because of the reaction to the trauma and the way we activate our system and we survive. So when people arrive to camps, and especially to people who are coming to from the east to the west, what's happening now, for example, in Europe, people need first of all to rebuild and re-establish their communities. So there is no community programs actually will work unless you activate the community itself. Because it's a small fragments, like hundreds of fragments of different fragments of this community, and you need to rebuild and re-establish this community. When we do so, and when we do so with understanding the huge importance of the power of the community, especially for people coming from the East, where the well-being and the psychology is based on the collective well-being, not in the individual well-being, as in the West. And it's not about good and bad; it's about differences between culture, as mentioned in the previous question. So when we address this with this kind of understanding about the differences, then we can actually re-establish the community. Then the community starts heal itself, and you don't need actually to bring programs or anything, because actually you will make some kind of contamination, because you're a white person, we are Western, not me, as an aid worker, most of the aid work come and humanitarian come from the West. You will never ever, even with all your sensitivity to the different between cultures and etc., it's the best that the community build a program. So if you try to give the program, it will not work. Just provide the tools and provide the space and the safe space where people can rebuild their community. Then they will activate the community as they see, and then you will start seeing the process of healing happening without any interventions that needed from any mental health professionals or etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dowd, for the response. I'm sure that we all learned something from it. Mr. Nyenhuis, from your experience as the director of Thrive Gulu and a program specialist in refugee resettlements in Massachusetts and Cambodia, could you tell us about how the pandemic has impacted the refugee or migrant children's education, health, and psyche?
Sure, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. A few years back, I was invited to be a part of the Yale UNICEF chapter's conference that was very similar to this. And so to get an invitation from Columbia is really just an honor. So thank you for that. with regards to the pandemic and how it's really affecting the refugee population, especially children, I would first say that we, as a global society, I think we've come to understand in many ways kind of the basics of how COVID is affecting all of us. So we've all come to learn about social distancing, the importance of washing hands, how this virus affects certain races disproportionately, how different ages disproportionately, that sort of thing. Most of that, I think, pretty much crosses over and carries over into the refugee population. One of the things that I think has also been very helpful, especially as someone who really works in the area of trauma recovery and mental health, is the role that COVID has played in adversely on individuals' mental health. So, things like social isolation and how that can lead to depression, how the economic fallout has, created a tremendous amount of stress, how some of these things have led to a spike in suicidal ideation and actual suicide successes, and gender-based violence, this sort of thing. Again, carries over to the refugee population. But one thing that I haven't really heard as much talk about is just how confusing and disorienting the pandemic is, how unpredictable it is. And I think that makes it really hard on refugees, because in so many ways, the refugee's life has been marked by precarity. Their lives hinge on this precarious moment that is marked by so much uncertainty and insecurity, where they just don't know what tomorrow is necessarily going to bring. And at some point in her history, a refugee child has had to wake up and realize that her world is no longer predictable, and that she's had to run and almost like Orpheus, she's not allowed to look back, that she just has to keep running. And for some time thereafter, it's and this could also very possibly affect her for the rest of her life. But let's just say, for in the immediate aftermath, that it's going to be impossible really to convince her that whatever world she's currently occupying is predictable in any real or meaningful kind of way. She's just not going to feel safe because of this kind of chaos and this confusion. And she had to run once, and so she's she may very well have to run again, and she doesn't know when or how or to where. And in some ways it's like the world to which she awoke was not even the world to which she awoke. And that's incredibly hard on the psyche, I think. And I don't know, I don't want to go too long, but one of the other things that I think is very difficult, and I also come from both a kind of a spiritual background, because I was trained at the Yale Divinity School, but also kind of a philosophical background. And I think some of this is also helpful. I mean, it's not as tangible as some of the things that my colleagues have mentioned. But I think that it's helpful to kind of even think about these other factors that I believe are important. One of the things also about that the refugee child, I think, encounters is almost like a prohibition to speak. And part of this, she brings upon herself. She's so traumatized that the very thought of bringing, either there are no words. Maybe she is unable to speak or not yet able to speak. And, in some cases, she's specifically commanded not to talk about what happened, sometimes from a family member or someone else. And so this notion of not being allowed to speak is also very painful for the child, and also very confusing for the child. Then on top of that, you've got this COVID thing going on, and one of the classic symbols, I think, of silence is a mask. And so all of a sudden she's got not only not allowed to speak, but she even has this extra barrier that is really just blocking her her interaction, her communion with other people. You know, whether it's her peers or even her family members. And you know, I think behind that mask, there's so much worry and concern and trauma. And so we really need to think about how to address that. It's, you know, and this is specifically in this age of COVID-19. And I think one of the things that we as professionals who engage children can do is really just encourage them to express themselves, to find ways where and outlets and you know, means where they can express themselves, where they can tell their story, where they're encouraged to do that. Certainly not forced, but just encouraged and supported in that, so that they feel safe in that place again.
Thank you, Mr. Hirsch, for that very enlightening response. I also see Dr. Alastair Ager. Hello. Please allow me to introduce him. Dr. Alastair Ager, he is the director of the Institute for Global Health and Development at Queen Margaret University in Edinburgh, where he is also the director of the National Institute for Health Research Unit on Health in Situations of Fragility. Also, he is a professor with the Department of Population and Family Health here at Columbia. Dr. Ager? I'm not sure if his connection is still on, but for now, I think we can move on to some of the Q&A questions. And when Dr. Ager is back, we can ask him one of our questions. So I do see here a lot of the questions are quite similar for Dr. Dowd. So there are several international participants in our audience. Thank you for joining us for Germany and also internationally. They are asking, what are some of the ways as an NGO or as a psychiatrist and psychotherapist to help refugees with acute mental health issues? And is there any possibility to help them directly, eventually in a war zone? Or is there a way for them to help in their communities?
It's a good question. Actually, what we are doing now, and for the first 2-3 years of my work, I have just a background with me. I'm a Palestinian. It's a little bit weird that a Palestinian is actually talking about other refugees, and you know, I'm not in the position of the victim or in the position of the one who received aid, but I'm in the position who was actually providing aid. You know, being a Palestinian with our own agency as UNRWA, you know, all the people has UNHCR and the Palestinian has his own agency just because of the large number of Palestinians. But we actually are talking here about how we can translate narratives, how we can translate experiences. I just decided, with the help of my family and the whole community where I lived and how I raised, but this is an option, that I don't want to be a victim. I want to translate 70 years of war, of occupation, to knowledge. No one can treat any refugee around the world better than me. I'm an ex-refugee, I'm a mental health expert, I have the culture, I have the background. So why I need to still be a victim working in my country when I can actually provide this to someone else and can share my knowledge to someone else and also help myself and help my community and my people to translate this. So from this point to reach the question is the same like this. We don't need to wait 70 years or for people to translate what happened to them or to reach the treatment. I think what we should do is to prevent. We should prevent trauma to make the damage, to do damage to the people. So I prefer, as a mental health professional, to be in a war zone in time zero when the war is happening inside the rescue boats in the front of Libyan coast where I work sometimes, and to prevent the trauma from happening, because prevention is an act. Treatment is a long process, and trust me, with a low prevalence of success, because we know that PTSD and complex PTSD and other mental health issues is very hard to treat. So yes, the question is we need to be there. If we are talking about human beings, we need to know that there is a soul and a mind next to the body, as important as the shelter and the first aid and the physical first aid. We should acknowledge that there is a mental health first aid and should be provided not years or weeks or days. It should be exactly where the white helmets in Syria, they should also be the white helmets that provide mental health first response. Because if you do so, then you will prevent, and prevention is a very it's a single act sometimes that will prevent a lot of long process of treatment. So yes, this is what we try to do now in Humanity Proof, from transforming our knowledge and also our first 2-3 years of work that we were focusing in psychosocial support in general. And we are now focusing the service to our beneficiaries is specifically in this very, what I called it also and in my TED talk as a golden hour. I want to be there in this golden hour where I can actually do an intervention that can last forever and can change the whole clinical presentation of the trauma in the future.
Thank you for your response. That is very informative. Professor Whistles, in your response, you talked about cultural humility to an extent. And here, Melissa asked a question that I think that would be relevant for you to answer. The children who are fleeing away have each their own story and culture as well. What can we do to obtain their own culture in a foreign country without isolating themselves from the others? If they build their own community, they will always feel different than the others. Thank you, Melissa, for a very thoughtful question.
Yeah, thank you for that good question. The first thing is to listen to children and to give them space so that we can learn their lived experience and understand, how they're feeling. Humanitarians from outside, myself included, oftentimes enter with preconceived ideas. So for example, probably the most widespread idea in war zones amongst psychologists and psychiatrists is that trauma and PTSD are the biggest problems. And they are big problems, to be sure. But, I've been in a war zone where, for example, someone told me that my big problem, this was told by an 8-year-old girl, the government forces came and attacked my village. They, killed my parents. And the big problem was that I had to run away before I could bury them. It turned out, on talking with the girl further, that her belief was that the inability to bury her parents was creating, again, enormous spiritual problems, a lack of harmony with ancestors. And so, my preconceptions about what the problems are might not map onto hers. And then when we asked what would help, she said, well, where I live, we have these, burial rituals that are done, and local healers can help do that. So the first thing is to background our preconceptions and learn from the affected people themselves. The second point is to consider the possibility that there are some local resources that themselves might be quite helpful. And then the third key point is, to recognize that lots of refugees, lots of displaced people, as Dr. Dowd has said eloquently, are uprooted from their families and communities. So beginning the process of reweaving social connection. It may not look like specialized therapy. It may not feel like a real, quote, real counseling or psychosocial support, but group activities, group decision-making, play, even sports, bringing young people together and helping them reweave bonds can build a basis of peer support. My experience in over 50 war zones is that peer support oftentimes has greater long-term impact than does counseling and psychotherapy, although I'm not trying to diminish the importance of the other. And then the other thing that we have to remember is that response has to be holistic. The IASC guidelines on mental health and psychosocial support in emergency settings are very clear about this. The biggest stressor might be the inability to feed your family. A child might be terribly upset because they can't go to school or because they see their siblings and even their parents going hungry. So in that context, there might be economic supports that are every bit as important as supports that look like more traditional psychological supports. So we have to think about the social, the cultural, and the economic, the educational, all at the same time, and this creates big challenges. But we can do that, and if we do, it will strengthen children's resilience in these very challenging circumstances. Thanks.
Thank you for your inspiring response, Professor Wessels. This next question is for Mr. Hirsch. What has been the biggest challenge for you to do your work in the past and now during the COVID-19 pandemic, as you are the director of Life Guru in Northern Uganda?
Thank you for the question. That's a difficult question. Let's see. There's so many challenges that you face on a day in and day out basis. But I suppose one of the biggest challenges is really just getting people to do, in some ways, exactly what Dr. Wessels just mentioned. And we at Thrive Gula, we take a very holistic approach to trauma recovery as well. And basically what we do is we establish empowerment groups. And within each empowerment group, we deliver a package of services. And that includes economic empowerment services through something called Village Savings and Loan Associations. We provide adult literacy. We do gender-based violence work. We do leadership training so that people can assume leadership skills within the group, like the president of the group and the treasurer and that sort of thing. And then, of course, we also do mental health counseling. One of the challenges is to kind of get people to kind of hook people on this notion of holistic healing and holistic support. A lot of people initially, the idea of economic empowerment is very appealing to them. The idea of being supported in some kind of business education where they can, create a sort of business plan, income generating activity support. And then of course this, kind of microfinance program with the Village Savings and Loan, very popular. But once you start talking about counseling, this as Dr. Wessels also mentioned, it can be, just kind of a strange phenomenon, and he used the word imposition. And it certainly can be when, if we're kind of trying to impose, especially a very Western style therapeutic, methodology upon them. So it's difficult to kind of get them together and involved in all of these activities. And what we really do is we try to just require that as part of the participation. But there's still a lot of resistance. So I would say that that's a challenge. It's not a major challenge, but that's an important challenge that we face. But that is absolutely key for us to deliver the services that we want to. In a COVID environment, all of that kind of broke down. The whole notion of the empowerment group kind of fell apart because we couldn't bring people together. People were very frustrated because it was difficult for them to access the little bit of money that they had saved up in the Village Savings and Loan Association, so that they could, withdraw that as a loan for themselves. There were all of these kind of hiccups in the system because of especially the social distancing and the lockdown measures. So that's been something that we're actually still continue to work on because it's not easy to find simple solutions to that. Some of the ways we've managed to continue delivering support is through using what we've trained a lot of lay counselors and gender-based violence monitors. These are just kind of people within the community who have more or less volunteered. They receive a very, very small stipend. But these individuals have been trained by our Thrive staff, and they've been trained to deliver very basic emotional support, kind of basic counseling services. They're trained in crisis intervention so that they can kind of, hopefully stop a suicide if it's about to happen, intervene in a domestic violence situation. And then they refer to us. So they've been very, very helpful. So that's one way that we've been able to troubleshoot some of the challenges, I think, that are on the ground because of this COVID.
Thank you, Mr. Hirsch, for the very informative response. Ms. Greta Gunnarsdottir, I want to go back to your previous response about your work have been done to help the refugees and how to ensure that their education is still going on and they are still receive the proper education. I'm also wondering, what are some of the biggest challenges you have been facing, either before COVID and also during this time of the COVID-19 pandemic? And what are some of the measures you have been taken to tackle these measures, to tackle these difficulties?
Yeah, I think I partly covered it in my earlier intervention. I mean, because and I would like to pick up, I mean, what Essam said about not being a victim, because I think that is also important. Just as a general comment, that the refugees are people in their own full right that deserve respect and dignity, but there is no denying very often the circumstances that they are living under. And that is really what, when it comes to education, for example, I mean, there are, I think our strength, and we have been providing quality education, and our students repeatedly score very high on national exams and so on. I mean, it is clear that our students are very competitive when it comes to, students that come from government schools. So we are, I think overall, we are doing a very good job, but we have challenges such as very big classes. I mean, the average class in an UNRWA school is 40 students and over 40 in Gaza. And of course, this is one of the issues that now with the pandemic is because now we are introducing more like blended or hybrid education. So even if you split the class in two, you have 20 kids in a class, which in a lot of other countries is considered to be more than a maximum. And so in that sense, but we have some of our schools have been destroyed also in like Syria. A number of schools have been destroyed, and there is the environment that the students, for example, in the OPT are living under. There is a lot of tension and uncertainty, and talking about the lack of predictability. I think that that applies very much in the OPT in Syria and also in Lebanon, and this may be because of the situation that despite receiving good quality education, which is the right, and which we are supposed to also provide, I mean, according to the UN, our mandate, but it's also this, I mean, what then afterwards? I mean, once you have your education, and that is, there is a lot of lack of hope under the current circumstances, and that was also before COVID, and that relates to mainly the conditions, you know, the conditions, the overall living conditions in our fields of operation, and that is, I think, with refugees, you know, it is this constant unpredictability. I mean, that's just, it's a part of, and just having gone through the trauma of becoming a refugee, one has seen it. I mean, I'm not only referring to maybe what I've learned through UNRWA, but just in general with refugee communities that I have gotten to know, that this is something that is very much a part of life, and that is, I think it is has been very useful to listen to my fellow panelists. I mean, when it comes to these issues on how to address them, and with our beneficiaries, I mean, we have, of course, like with our Palestine, I mean, with the Palestine refugees that were living in Syria, a lot of them are displaced within Syria and to Jordan and to Lebanon. And some of these people, I mean, and that is also what I would like to say, I mean, because we have been in existence for 70 years, and you have people that you run into, and I can mention just a refugee that I met many years ago when I was also working for UNRWA. He was in Aleppo, an old elderly gentleman, and he was telling us about when he fled with his mother, and his mother thought they would be away for 3 days, and there he was in Aleppo. You know, it's you know, but then you have people being displaced again, and so yeah, so that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you for the informative response. This is the final question for Dr. Ager. Dr. Ager, you have been working in the field of global health and development for over 30 years. Based on your experience, how do you think we can eliminate the stigma associated with refugees so that they are not perceived as criminals for seeking a better life elsewhere?
Thank you, Yao, and apologies for my internet connection, and I'm so delighted just to be able to join you towards the end of the session. And I heard some of the earlier discussion, and I want to link my answer to something I heard Dr. Daoud say earlier on. A lot of my work has been around evaluating interventions, particularly around children's well-being, and working with colleagues like Dr. Wessels, who spoke earlier on. And I think we can do a lot in the short term in child-friendly spaces and education in schools, sort of shorter term interventions. But I think Dr. Daoud spoke about the longer term community processes that are vital for children's settlement and well-being. And in a recent review I completed, very much building on a social ecological framing, which again I know Dr. Wessels will have alluded to, we're thinking about things that are happening in children's lives directly, but also within their family, within their parents and the experience of their parents, within their community, and then the broader social political environment that shapes that. And clearly your question about stigma is not just about working for children's individual resilience so that they may be able to forge new lives for themselves and their parents be able to equip them and support them in that process. It's clearly talking to wider community and indeed broader societal conditions for resettlement and integration or for return. A lot of my work has been on refugee integration. And I just want to share one specific example from a recent study that although I would part of my passions and theories point to quite big political issues about integration and reducing stigma. Consistently, we find evidence of the importance of neighborliness, the absolute importance of just a small, subtle interaction with a neighbor, with someone within your close neighborhood, or whether they are friendly and welcoming to you, or whether they are hostile or just ignore you. And I don't want to belittle the importance of the broader political sense of welcome and integration, but I do want to point that the mechanisms, the drivers of reducing stigma are often in small interactions within communities. Now, clearly those small interactions will be shaped by broader political discussions around the place of refugees, but it's also driven by communities, by welcome, by acts of kindness, by generosity and hospitality. And I think that we should certainly drive at a political level to encourage welcome, but we also need to work at a neighborhood level, I think, and at a community level to ensure that that sort of idea of welcome is sustained in small everyday interactions. And there's a lot of evidence that points hugely to a sense of security and settlement for refugee children and their families.
Thank you so much for your response. It is indeed very, very informative and inspiring. Thank you, Dr. Ager, Dr. Dowd, Ms. Gunnarsdottir, Mr. Hirsch, and Professor Wessels for your informative responses. Thank you all. I'm sure that we have all learned something important from this panel. That concludes our first panel. The next panel starts at 12 p.m. Eastern Time.
Thank you so much.